My name is Justin Zobel. I'm the Pro Vice Chancellor for Graduate International Research from the University of Melbourne. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and their ancestors, past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge any Indigenous people who are in the audience tonight. It is a privilege to be at this event. We are extremely grateful to the EU and its member nations, and in particular Austria and Germany, for hosting it for us. Also, I feel we are very privileged in having such a distinguished audience. Too many to acknowledge, but I'd particularly like to mention His Excellency, the Austrian Ambassador, Bernhard Zimburg, and the Honorary Consul for Germany, Mr. Michael Pierce. Thank you. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to your MC for the evening, Martin Moenhausen.
Thank you very much. You don't get away with just a simple movie night tonight with popcorn. You also have to listen to some speeches and panelists. So we have an eminent list of speakers here, and the first one will be His Excellency Bernhard Zimburg. We have then Kylie White from the Department of Environment, Land and Water and Planning here from Victoria, and we have afterwards a panel discussion of around 30 minutes or so on that film, which I think is a great documentary about what seems distant history now. Multilateralism doesn't seem to be high at the moment in the fashion of the day. At this point, I also would like to thank the tremendous work of a number of PhD students from the Climate and Energy College who made all the technical part here happening, and we have an overflow room of around 80 people in the Climate and Energy College, just about 500 meters in that direction. So you're the lucky ones here in the main auditorium, and I say hello as well to those in the Climate and Energy College. Without further ado, thank you, Ambassador, for joining us today. Over to you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your patience. I know I'm late, which is a bad thing to do, but I got caught in an unexpected traffic jam, and therefore my delay. Sorry about that. Let me start with acknowledging the distinguished hosts and panelists who have shown up tonight. Professor Justin Zobel, the Pro Vice Chancellor of the University. Then Ms. Kylie White, representing Minister D'Ambrosio. Associate Professor Malte Mainshausen. Then the panelists, Dr. Ursula Hutfilter, Carolyn Ingvarson, Mr. Graham Hunter, and Filip Malinowski, who is the director of the film we're going to see. And last but certainly not least, Michael Pierce, the German Honorary Consul. Thank you very much for having joined us. Ladies and gentlemen, the Paris Agreement is a momentous step in the history of the global governance of our planet, and in a way, it really is a fairy tale material. And this Paris Agreement, or the making of the Paris Agreement, is the subject of this film. After 20 years of negotiations, 195 sovereign countries pledged to hand over a healthier planet to future generations and to set common rules to exercise our collective responsibility in climate action. We all congratulated ourselves when the Paris Agreement entered into force at lightning speed, less than a year after it was signed. This was unprecedented, and this despite the United States withdrawal its support. That is testament to our collective determination of governments, to the resilience of the Paris Agreement construction as an environmental pact, and to French diplomacy. But 2.5 years after the Paris Agreement was signed, there is no place for complacency. 2018 is a crucial year in which we find ourselves globally in a state of emergency on several fronts. There is the global emission, which has increased last year for the first time in 3 years again. Climate-related disasters are increasing in intensity and in frequency. Vulnerable countries are getting hit harder than ever. Security risks arising from climate change are mounting. Delivery time is approaching fast for parties of the Paris Agreement to agree on its operating rules. We have until the end of this year, the so-called COP24 in Katowice, Poland. The European Union is working tirelessly to keep the spirit of Paris alive. We have played a consistent role in the construction and implementation of the global climate policy. And over the past 3 decades, we have continued the work to enhance climate action. We are the first global donor in climate finance and development aid. In 2016, the European Union, a group, has already exceeded its own targets for 2020 by having decreased emissions by 23%. However, this does not entirely apply for my own country, Austria, as still we have to achieve a CO2 reduction of 14% within the next 2 years in order to comply with the target set out by the European Council. This will be a very severe challenge to us. Under the Paris Agreement, we have committed to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by at least 40% until 2030, the most ambitious commitment of the developed world. But we know that this is not enough, and we are planning to increase our ambition as soon as possible. As part of the so-called Talanoa dialogue designated by and designed by the Fijian Climate Presidency this year, all countries are all encouraged to highlight progress since Paris, share best practices and opportunities for future action. This is why I'm glad to have with us tonight Ms. Carolyn White, Deputy Secretary in Victoria's Environment Department, to talk about Victoria's groundbreaking climate legislation. What Victoria does can happen around the world. In many ways, it is happening in various forms in many regions and cities in Europe and beyond, in line with local conditions and capabilities, not only demonstrating that ambitious climate action is possible, but that it is good for the economy and for development. This is why in the European Union we are optimistic, because it is now clear that fighting climate change is not a scientific or a technological problem anymore. We have the solutions. It is not anymore a global governance problem. We have the Paris Agreement. Climate action is mostly a change management problem. As is the case in Victoria, throughout the world, governments, cities, local councils, and communities are taking action into their own hands and are shifting the goalposts as we speak. But change is not easy, and we are not collectively doing enough just yet to reach the goals we set out in the Paris Agreement. This is why it is important to relentlessly remind us all of the stakes at risk. This is why and what tonight's film is screening all about. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. And now I invite Kylie White, representing Minister de Damhose.
Thank you. It's very bright. I might move this way if that's okay. Good evening, and thank you, Malta, for your kind introduction. And also I'd like to acknowledge His Excellency Dr. Bernhard Zimburg tonight, Ambassador of Austria, and also Pro Vice-Chancellor Justin Zobel. Thank you for your introductory remarks. Filip Malinowski, who's the Director of Guardians of the Earth, and other distinguished guests who are with us this evening. It's a bit awkward here too. I'm sorry, around paper shuffling. It's a pleasure to be here, and I know that the Minister would have liked to have been here but has been committed elsewhere. This evening I've been asked to briefly talk about the Victorian Government's commitment to acting on climate change with reference to the Paris Agreement and the Climate Change Act, which was introduced in Victoria in 2017. But first of all, I think I'd like to acknowledge what the European Union has done to advance climate change action. The Victorian Government recognises the important role the European Union has had in creating and maintaining momentum right across the globe for action on climate change. The Government also recognises the critical role played by the European Union in delivering the landmark Paris Agreement. As we know, nations across the globe have then been, if you like, been a force for action in order to be able to advance climate change. Excuse me while I change my page. I think the Ambassador did this better than I did, which showed a degree of professionalism in speech making. To achieve the climate reductions of at least 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees over time, the Paris Agreement states that globally we need to achieve net zero emissions by the second half of the 21st century. The Victorian Government is committed to fully playing its part, and the Climate Change Act is the way in which we will drive this change in Victoria. The Climate Change Act, as I mentioned, which was introduced in 2017, includes a long-term target of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. 2020 might have been a struggle. By 2050. Consistent with the Paris Agreement's approach, the Climate Change Act requires the Victorian Government to set 5-yearly interim targets. These targets commence in 2020 when we set our first target, and then from 5 years in 5-yearly intervals we set future targets. I'd also like to say that when we set these targets, each target is higher than the previous target, which means that the cumulative impact over time is greater than each 5-year interval. This sets some challenges, and I know that other countries are also dealing with this, but it also means the Victorian Government has set a very high bar, and in doing so has been able to introduce some actions in which to achieve that. The key ones for those are around setting a target to reduce the state's emissions by 15 to 20% below 2005 levels by 2020. Setting targets for renewable electricity of 25% by 2020 and 40% by 2025. In addition, the government's provided considerable funding to achieve these targets and provided $146 million to drive investment in renewable electricity through the Renewable Energy Action Plan, and $55 million to drive actions for improvements in energy efficiency across industry and households. It is through these actions that the Victorian Government is hoping to achieve considerable reductions over time and promote and if you like, enable other states to see how we're acting in order to be able to make similar changes in their emissions profile. The Victorian Government has been very active and has actually acknowledged significantly the need for state jurisdictions to play a part in global climate change efforts and to prepare communities for unavoidable climate change impacts while ensuring that the state remains prosperous, a livable place to be, and somewhere that we would be comfortable living post-2050. The film tonight is a timely reminder of not just the importance of the Paris Agreement, but the actions that speak louder than words. Congratulations to the European Union, to the delegation here today for organising the event, and to Filip for his great work on The Guardians. I'm looking forward to see it. I hope you are too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You thought you came here for a documentary tonight, huh? We have another 10 speeches now lined up. No, but the importance of having here Victoria speaking is we had Paris as a sweet history in time when the savviness of French diplomacy and the Obama administration and multilateralism appetite for joint, the world coming together, was providing that one sweet spot chance in history where the international level can sort out a framework on which we can build upon. And now it is about the importance is on local action and state action, and this is exactly where Victoria fits in, and is one of the states that spearheads the joint travel towards a zero emissions future. So thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you to those back over in the Climate Energy College. I'm informed that you have the additional advantage of popcorn, which we don't have. But anyway, I wish you an enjoyable documentary. I was myself in the Paris negotiation, and I can tell you this is as close as it gets in terms of a documentary. It is a fantastic document of where history was made. Enjoy. Thank you. Thank you so much. We are now delighted to have a panel discussion, and first join me in welcoming the filmmaker of Guardians of the Earth, Filip Malinowski. I will invite the whole panel. We have also Carolyn Ingvarson from Lighter Footprints. Graham Hunter from the United Nations Association and the coordinator of the Climate Change Program, and Ursula Fuentes, a senior German official, having been almost a dinosaur in the UNFCCC negotiation. First question to you, Filip. First, congratulations for that fantastic movie. You probably have been compared quite a lot also to other movies who make the world think that it's all about a solar patent that can be given to India, and that is where the Paris negotiations surrounded around. So congratulations on drawing a much more differentiated picture. Or, of course, for those of us, and many of you have been in the negotiations for long, there are still subtleties where we would think, there are so many other stories around that. But the one question I wanted to ask you is, you say it's a documentary. The one thing where I really think you must have used special effects is when in the final night, Laurent Fabius, you see him over the whole course of the documentary getting more tired and tired because he's in the center of the negotiations. And then he sits down with you saying, in a couple of hours, I'm going to present a text. How did you do that?
I made the French Foreign Ministry lie. Just as simple as that. Yeah.
So you recorded that for 2 weeks in advance?
It was, of course, we had recorded two versions. No? we had 2,000 journalists in Paris, and just one interview room that had also an open ceiling, so you could hear 35,000 people walking and running. So, of course, getting Laurent Fabius in the last hours to give this interview would have been impossible. This is the interview we had to shot afterwards. Yeah, that's true. Good eye.
Good. Next question, Carolyn. It is part of the European Diplomacy Week. Now we see Australia here presented at higher levels by Woolcott, in maybe words about coal for what Australia is known for at the world stage. As negotiator in the negotiations, you feel there are always, also there's a role of Australia which is very positively influential in the negotiations, which is they have a very savvy and technically apt negotiation team that can put forward technical proposals on the reporting, etc., and can act relatively quickly, which, for example, an EU can't, because it's such a large body and it's much more inert and has to negotiate within itself. So having negotiation teams like Australia also has some positive role. I just wanted to mention because it's the Diplomacy Week. But But Carolyn, the question to you, how can Australia in the future also at a higher level play a positive force in this fight against climate change?
Oh, just a little question like that. Before I plunge into how Australia is going to change the world, just in response to the reaction I had to the film, apart from feeling emotional and exhausted by it, absolutely, you sit there with the pain in your hands, knowing the outcome and just having to go through it. Nevertheless, amazing stuff. I'm really feeling like I've been through the mill. I did have a funny reaction at the end when I saw John Kerry saying what he said about, of course we have to use coal and gas for some time to come into the future, and this is a given thing, and we've got to move on from that, and we know where we're going. I thought, well, now we just got a fossil award for saying that, and I thought, this is it's a thing that you can bag coal very easily. You can easily throw coal and say, eat that. We've done it in our parliament, haven't we? But it's a big issue how we move from the huge commitment we have in Australia to our energy being based on cheap coal. And it isn't going to go away very fast. And how we fight it and what we do is the focus of a lot of our energy in the community. You've asked me how we do this, and I think I might pass that question on.
So,
Yeah.
do you want to?
Not yet.
We get the instructions for how Australia can play a positive role further down the line. Thank you. Now, question to Ursula. She has been through many negotiations, Cancun, Den Haag, etc. In the last night, we always saw that the negotiation text was further weakened. In Paris, and it comes through in the end of the movie, it was amazing. We had an okay negotiation text, but then the final text was in many respects even better. And so we had a constellation with savvy French diplomacy and outstanding Christiana Figueres and an Obama administration that was willing to go down that line. When next, now that we feel Washington needs adult supervision more than anything else, when next do we have a world geopolitical constellation that would allow such a multilateral agreement to come about? And are we dependent on it? Or did the international level now did their bit and now it's up to Victoria and the local governments to do the action?
I think the good news is that we don't have to have such a situation every year or every few years because the Paris Agreement is there to last. So and that's this amazing process that you have captured, Philip, so fantastically in this film. That really everybody who watches it can feel, how it's such a such an important decision that if it fails, then, or if it had failed, then so much would have failed. Not even just on climate change, which is already big enough, but the whole hope of keeping multilateralism working was really at stake. So there was so much at stake. So. It's good that this doesn't have to happen at this level all the time because it's there to last. And indeed, I think why it happened was because there was so much leadership, and certainly, I think the French presidency was not just savviness; it was real leadership in a sense of taking this so seriously and knowing that what the way they would lead this process also was quite influential or critical for the result. But also all that leadership of all those countries, all these vulnerable countries that have been fighting for this outcome for many years. And indeed, it's true, and I also know it as a former EU negotiator that many other countries went to Paris not thinking that they would have to agree to that ambitious goal. That was the same for the EU and for many others. So I think that leadership of those countries that knew how much it mattered and had the science behind them, and that they stood to it, and also against all the pressure that over many years was being held against them, saying, look, give up on this, because if you aim too high, you risk failing the whole thing. And it was the other way around. So that leadership, but also the leadership of those leaders that you mentioned, that then helped making this possible, plus the whole situation that we had of all those solutions being there, and people wanting those solutions, that of course helped, and that was different in other situations that I have been through in negotiations. So we don't have to have this every time, because the Paris Agreement is there to say, but indeed now it's about implementing it, and that is, and there we also need leadership at all levels. We still need leadership from heads of state and governments, from parliaments, but we also need, and we do have that leadership at other levels, at regional level, at local level, and that is what will matter indeed. But then also to keep that Paris Agreement and live up to it, and not start reinterpreting it or start moving it into something less ambitious than what it's intended to be.
Thank you. Graham, and this is my last question, and then it's your turn, and we also have a question, as I hear from the other auditorium. Graham, the question to you. When I watched this documentary with my 9-year-old son, he always nudged me, Daddy, is that a goodie or a baddie? So, for example, when you see Saudi Arabia talking about we need a target that is based on pure science, proven science, how can you make that distinction of, is he honest? How can the larger public relate to what is here actually at force? Who is calling the shots? Why? What are the reasons behind it? So it's an immense, nuanced and subtle game. It's almost a gourmet experience, the negotiations, because you see in the subtleties of words and how they change from one delegation to the other, or over time. That is actually the things that matter. This is how you can feel the pulse of the negotiations, how it moves along. So that is a very subtle business. Now put that against the backdrop of a G7 negotiation being derailed for the purpose of having a better photo opportunity in Singapore, and the times that we currently live in. How can we create in the public the hunger for leaders that engage and invest in nuanced multilateralism, honest negotiations?
Thank you for that question. Let me just say, Filip helped us to work out that Australia was a baddie by the background music and the slow motion that our delegates had. So we're under no illusion that Saudi Arabia and Australia weren't helping things, at least at that stage. I think probably just commenting on that, it's fair to say, as you just mentioned, that Australia has been considered to be fairly constructive, and indeed came behind the more ambitious group at the end. I am thinking in the same way as Ursula about the whole question of leadership. And I've watched the film a couple of times. I think the brilliance of the French need to be recognised in guiding the whole conference. But I think the remarkable moment is when Laurence Fabius at the end states that he puts the agreement to the delegates, and I'm sure he said, "I see no objection to it," before he looked up. Yeah. And that was sort of part of brilliance. So to your question, the role of leadership is certainly one that comes through very strongly in the multilateral negotiations. And by leadership, I guess we're talking about inspiration. So that while there can be disillusionment at something like a G7 get together, what we have is a sort of a long-term underlying commitment. The film drew out brilliantly the negotiations, particularly in relation to the 1.5 degree limit. What we didn't quite see, but which was very critical to the whole conference, was the role, for example, of the subnational governments, indeed the private sector. And so while one might look at the film and see, well, that depends upon the national governments, indeed, what has been captured is a commitment much more broader than that. So while in different countries, and ours is one, the US is another, there may be declines and rises in the national government's commitment, there is now a much sort of broader commitment across all levels of government. And here in Australia, one can turn to the states and the cities and local governments, most of whom have relatively ambitious targets that they're pursuing.
Thank you. The floor is open. We have 2 roaming mics. Raise your hand if you want to ask a question.
Thank you. Jean Blackley from Project Drawdown Australia. I hope I've got a question particularly direct to Ursula, but I hope you don't mind indulging me for a moment in just an acknowledgement of Filip. You know, filmmaking is an art form, and documentary filmmaking is quite an art form. And I think if you think about how dry a subject, a conference of tens of thousands of diplomats debating a document with 2,000 bracketed phrases, sounds like scintillating viewing, doesn't it? And I think of another art form, which is winemaking, and indulge me here. A great Australian winemaker said that you can always tell a great wine when you want to drink 2 bottles on Tuesday night. And for me, the comment I want to make, Filip, is that the benefit of this being my 3rd viewing of your documentary is that I remembered to pack the tissues this time. So I just wanted, I think other people here probably like to just acknowledge again what an astounding achievement it was. And of the 2 made at the conference, I definitely rate this a better one, certainly more balanced. The question, Ursula, is around the diplomatic achievement and the view of the diplomatic path from here, in that we have the agreement as it stands, but as you presented today in your great presentation at lunchtime, thank you, you highlighted the degree of commitment of the nations today has us on a path of somewhere in the range of 2.6 to upward almost 4 degrees. Is the current pathway we're on in terms of commitments. So I'm interested to ask from a diplomatic point of view that with the achievement of that conference and what it managed to achieve and what it didn't manage to achieve, what's your optimistic view of the diplomatic pathway from here in years to come to go, you know, in 6 months or 2 years or 5 years from now, we're not really achieving this goal of well under 2 degrees on our current degree of commitment. What's the viewpoint from where you stand with all your years of experience and how it evolves from here?
Well, the optimism comes because we have a great framework with the Paris Agreement that needs to be fleshed out. So what diplomats now have to work on, and that's at stake now. They have set themselves this deadline for this conference of the parties coming up in Poland, in Katowice, at the end of the year, to define the rule book for how we do exactly this, checking whether we are on track or how we are closing the gap together, what countries are doing, how that adds up and how we do cooperative mechanisms, make them work so that we really count what needs to be counted. So that's the job of the diplomats to somehow draw this rule book. But the job is not just for diplomats, it's now really the package and then that recognition of the urgency, and that's why, and that was one of those elements that came into the whole into the Paris Agreement and its complementing decision quite at the end, which is moving the timeline forward again, the timeline of increasing, of regularly checking where we are, and then inviting countries, parties to enhance their action. There was this general agreement when countries went to Paris that it would be something that would be started to be implemented in 2020, so we would have a lot of time because it would only enter into force then, and then we would be looking to 2030. So one could be a bit relaxed, but suddenly what we now have is something that has moved this timeline forward to something that many of these vulnerable countries had always said, we have to act much faster. And that's why we now have this timeline of checking every 5 years and starting even now. And the fact that the Paris Agreement has entered into force much earlier has, I guess, surprised many of the diplomats that went to Paris and thought there would be. And I remember some of the diplomats even coming back from Paris and still thinking that that was in there. And I was not part of the negotiations in Paris, so but I read the whole thing, of course, as soon as it was agreed. And I discovered that, and I was quite excited. So as I was about many other things that I had not hoped for. And that's not up to the diplomats. That's now really up to the leaders at national level, but at all other levels, to implement this and to enhance their action by 2020. And that's what this whole Talanoa dialogue is about, that we have started under the Fiji presidency and that will end also at the next conference.
Very short addition from Carolyn, and let's then briefly raise your hands. Who has more questions in the interest of time? Ian, do you have a question? Anybody else? Okay, and then
I just wanted to make a comment about the impact of that film on the business of leadership and how Salim struck me. He said he was not a player, but he clearly was a player. And what happens, it seems to me, is that the whole thing shifted with the emotion that came from the countries that got together and demonstrated what it meant to them in their lives, in their emotional depths, and that it was the conveying of that emotion, that business of telling an imagination what was going to happen. It was not just about the science, was it? It moved, and it seemed to me that we may well be missing the message that came out of that film, for me anyway, and that is that we got to get to the heart and be strong about the message of emergency which was there. It was this is not a joke, this is terrifying. And that moving moment when Christiana just broke down was pivotal, it seemed to me, in showing how the whole thing shifted over time. And you did it beautifully with that one characterization through our Bangladeshi. He spoke about it, but it leaves the sense that it's not just about the diplomats and how they are going to take that forward. It's about this message of desperate emergency that gets taken to the heart with pictures of stuff, and a much more emotional thing than I had envisaged. I was with the Saudi on the science, but not buying into the film.
Hi, yes, just to make the point that, of course, Paris, my name is Robin Eckersley. I'm a professor of political science, and I've been following the climate negotiations for a while.
it has also been in Paris.
Yes, in fact, I attended 4 of the 5 negotiations leading to Paris, the annual ones. I love the way you focused on the High Ambition Coalition, because it's a moral story, and it was effectively a moral coalition. But of course, there's a long background there in terms of the negotiations, particularly the role of the US and China, which was rather shadowy. I mean, the EU did play quite a leadership role because it was part of that moral coalition with Tony de Bruyn from the Marshall Islands. But the landing zone for Paris was created by the US. You can trace a direct line from the core mitigation provisions back to their submissions in 2013. And if you go back and read China's emissions inside, that they didn't really get much up, but they conceded. So what you chose to bring to the foreground was that story coming from behind and pulling all those major emitters into this fight, this moral snowball that was growing, particularly in the second week, that got that high ambition over the line, particularly the 1.5 degrees, but there was more to the story. So this was obviously something you chose to select to feature, to tell that story, because there are so many stories that could be told as to what went on behind the scenes there. But particularly the cooperation of the US and China in the very end game, and of course the joint statement back in 2014. So you saw how the baddies fell away by the sheer force of morality, you might say. But I mean, how much was this a conscious decision, or how much did this just fall on your lap during the course of filming? Because no one quite was able to predict the announcement of this high ambition, which didn't even go public till the middle weekend of those 2 negotiations. So I'd just like just to tell us a little bit about how you decided to bring that into relief, and how much of that was a surprise to you and it kind of fell in your lap in the course of your filming.
Great question. Sure. Film is a very limited medium. We have maybe 90 minutes to tell something extremely complex. You could fill books about. I feel after editing this film, I feel I could write a PhD thesis about negotiations or about climate change science. And in the end, of course, we have limited time. We have limited attention span. There are limitations to this medium and to the narration. And we had the wonderful luck that we didn't have Carol, the leader of the EU, on the agenda. We met her just by accident, as many things developed on the go and on the run in Paris. So this is the reason why we got access to knowing about this secret plans of creating this high ambition coalition. And in the end, it played an important role. Of course, we can't show things we don't have access to, like phone calls between Xi Jinping and Obama, and these things are just rumors. So there were, of course, many obstacles in the end that got cleared up just by phone calls between leaders and probably other geopolitical pressure that was used.
Thank you. Any quick final words, maybe which next documentary you would like to see from Filip about the neck, or maybe from Graham, and then we end with Filip with, you promised us at the beginning what Australia could do differently, and then we would invite His Excellency the Ambassador with some concluding words.
Well, congratulations to Filip. I think, as we've all said, the reflection of that particular focus highlighted the way in which these types of conferences take place and the underlying issues. The thing that always strikes me about the United Nations conferences, and I had the privilege of being both at the Copenhagen one and the Paris one in despair, the other in delight, was how 195 people can actually represent humankind. In the House of Commons, it's about 600 people that they require. And that, I think, illustrates the capacity and the potential that the world has to achieve the sort of things that were achieved at that conference. And hopefully it can be extended to many other of our global issues. So, thank you, Phil.
Okay, let's get on to the solutions promised.
Final words, and then we come to the conclusion.
Well, I think it's great, and also thank you from my side that you were able to make this documentary, because this is such an important moment to capture. I was in Copenhagen, but not in Paris, because by that time I had moved on in my responsibilities from international negotiations to domestic implementation. But that's why I was watching this closely and discussing a lot also with colleagues involved. Certainly this film gets many memories back to you of other negotiations, because many of these dynamics are the same. So you recognize that, and you remember things that you've heard, and many people have had many stories, and also many people have different stories from their way of seeing and experiencing Paris. I guess it would have also been interesting to compare, if you had the opportunity to do a documentary on Copenhagen, to see, what happened there and what was different in terms of leadership, but also in terms of the space of the solutions that wasn't quite as prominently there as we have it now. So that, of course, has also helped. My last point that I would like to make, because you also referred to the emotional aspects of it and how people can relate to it. So I was sitting at home and watching the final plenary, which you didn't show, that could have filled another documentary, just watching all the statements that came up, and they were also very emotional. My kids, like then young teenagers, were also around, and they kept watching it, and they really wanted to keep watching it. So that was also like a movie, like listening to all these emotions that came out after it was finally adopted, and all that could come out. And also my then minister, Barbara Hendricks, you can see her in the film sometimes. So the German Environment Minister was, of course, part of this Ambition Coalition, and had quite close exchange with the late Tony de Boom, this great leader from the Marshall Islands. And she talked also about that later on, and there were scenes of her at some point walking in and really in tears, which don't come here in the film, because she was so moved about, but then also all this tension coming out, and that's why we often then also cry in these situations. It's relief, it's all these feelings that come out, and I think it had a very strong impact on her in terms of how important it was also to fight for implementing ambitious policy. You could really see it, and I'm sure that happened with others. So that I hope that that has a lasting impact, and that your film can help creating that for others who haven't been there.
As a sort of grassroots community person, the Paris Agreement is the hook on our umbrella. It's what we hang on to in almost all the work that we do. We have to have something in Australia that we feel we're aiming for and we can at least hang our hat on, because things slip and slide. We have no bipartisan agreement here. We go one way and then we barrack for the other side and get up, and then that last 5 minutes before we're back into the race for down the slippery slope, up and down. One thing that gives us the hope that there is some stability, something you can keep referring to, is this stake in the ground now. We want net emissions by 2000. We're halfway through the century, we say, but that's a very big commitment that Australia is actually part of. And the 1.5 is extremely important, because it means you constantly have something to throw up and ask your politicians about. You can talk about it at local government level. How does this fit with the Paris Agreement that Australia is moving towards? Everywhere you go, you could do it. And people like talking about the Paris Agreement because they don't understand it. They just say, what does it mean? And it gives you an in to talking about the real action that might flow from this and what it might actually look like, and using our imagination to move away from a world that is in fact focused on coal in our society to something different. So we will continue to. In fact, I'm just wondering how many times we could use this film. How do we hold it? Where can we show it? Because we've got audiences. We go out into the local suburban communities, and we have forums and we run film nights, which raises people's understanding about what we're in. So I find it a hugely important tool. The film is a wonderful tool, but of course, the Agreement of Paris is just amazing for us. Even though we haven't got the biggest commitment in the world from Australia, we've got enough to keep ourselves in the game.
Yeah. So just in regard to what you said, I'm happy to share the film, and I'm also the producer of this film, so the distributor won't be happy about it, but for educational purposes, you can always write me an email and you receive the link, and also from the organizers who have the link, so you are free to spread the film in your interest groups. It's protected by a password, so it's a private use, educational use that you can push forward and spread it and raise discussion and form groups. I hope it helps. And now to the crash course, just to not have you walking out depressed into the rainy evening. We have first, I think, to identify what the problem is. And the problem is, of course, multiple. It's not just Australia. Australia gets bashed because, of course, I could bash also Poland, that is absolutely blocking the European Union in terms of progress. And I could be unhappy with the Austrians that have also reduced their ambitions, and the Germans are also far behind what Mrs. Hendricks, who was in tears working in a high mission coalition, managed to get through government. And actually we can take this case of Germany, because everybody looks up to Germany and is hoping that Germany is a kind of pioneer of change, and that everything works well. But actually these ambitious targets that Mrs. Hendricks, the German Ministry for the Environment, has established, like there are 3 sectors that contribute mainly to climate change. It's transportation, it's nutrition, especially meat production, and it's energy production. So it's 3 main sectors, and she didn't succeed basically because there was huge opposition from the lobbies and from the production side, from the industry that would have been affected. So our politicians have to address very strong measures and very strong changes to the way we eat, what we eat, how we transport ourselves, how we heat our houses. They have to address the fear of lack of employment, because what do we do within the mining nations if the miners have no jobs? Will they be re-educated, and so on and so on? What's the new world order? Who is going to lead in the future because of having cheap energy sources? So these are really very difficult questions, not only here but also up in Europe for us. And what can we do about it? We have lost 2 decades. We have lost 2 decades of pushing this transformation forward, because it needs time. It's such a complex thing. It needs trust, it needs time, it needs information. We have lost it basically because of the fossil fuel and industry that has been promoting disinformation, that has been funding scientists who say we are not sure if climate change exists. And then when it was not able anymore to say it doesn't exist, we are not sure if it's man-made. And still many people in the US and many citizens also in Australia believe climate change is not man-made, even farmers. So we have to fight this disinformation. This is also it's very easy, because we can talk to our friends, we can make film screenings, we can write our local politicians a letter. We can also influence a lot by being a good example. Just talking to the university decan about how is the money invested of the university, or how is the food in the mensa being produced? Is it vegan? How much meat do we eat? The very simple actions we can do to push things forward. And I think the most essential is also very easy. It's food, because if 1/3 is food, just stop eating meat or reduce meat consumption by 80%. It's also more healthy, and you have more lucky animals that don't live only to be slaughtered. Yeah, and then transportation, of course, as well. What you can do, I don't know, you have the choice in Australia, we have the choice in Germany, we can always change the provider of electricity, for example, of energy. So we have resilient providers, and you can just go online and change your provider. So you immediately remove funding, and you remove, by consuming, remove support for these corporations that don't really believe in sustainable future. So yeah, that's as much as I could do in a short course. I hope you have some tools at hand right now.
Thank you very much, Philip. Before we thank the panel and Philip, some concluding remarks from His Excellency the Ambassador.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for having endured. Part of my conclusion should be to thank our hosts who have made this evening possible, to show you the film and get you into the matter, and to thank the panelists for having structured our memory and our reflection on what we've seen tonight. Thank you very much. And that brings me to the point, what are we taking back home of tonight? I think if we take two words, it's the spirit of Paris, the coalition of ambition, and that this achievement will be carried to Katowice at the end of this year. We have heard about the dangers of becoming more shallow, of breaking up or changing this ambitious coalition. So this will be very important, that this spirit will be maintained. And then what also has been mentioned by the panelists is the contribution and the importance of the contribution by the individuals, by every individual. Because you will make, or will have to make, very important decisions as part of your community, as a professional at the workplace, as individual consumer, and as individual voter. And that, again, we should be aware that many of the key players we saw tonight are not in office anymore. There is no Laurent Fabius, there is no President Obama, there's no State Secretary Kerry, and even my own Minister of the Environment, who has been portrayed several times, is not in office anymore. So this spirit has to be carried on to new personalities who have to carry on the same idea, the same leadership, the same strength. So in this regard, thank you very much, and good night and good luck.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. You endured a long time. I just want to briefly thank also Carolyn Lambert from the EU and the member states. She's the star behind the organization, together with Anne Houston, who is not here with us, all the PhD students from the Climate and Energy College. You see also our next events here on that website. And now you deserved a drink. Thanks to the contribution from the German embassy, there are drinks out there in the foyer. Please use that chance also to talk to the panelists and Philip. And one last round of thank you to Philip and Carolyn and Ursula and Graham. Thank you very much.